Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله به نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Okay, so complicated topic. I'm going to do my best to talk about it in as efficient a way as possible. So everybody knows, or should know, that in Islamic law, in fiqh, there's two different kinds of ruling. There are what's called thawabit. These are rulings that don't change, regardless of time and space. And there's what's called Mutahayarat. These are rulings that change based on circumstance, based on the person involved, based on the situation involved, based on the time, the custom. So, for example, the thawabit include things like pork is prohibited. Pork is always prohibited. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're in France or in the United States or in Syria or in South Africa, whether it's the year 800 or the year 1800, pork is always prohibited. Of course, if you're dying of starvation, you can eat pork, but that's an exceptional circumstance. So these are things that are unchanging. These are thawabit rulings, don't change regardless of who is involved or when or where. The second type are mutaghayirat. Mutaghayirat are things that change based on circumstances. And these include a lot of areas like, let's say, mahar. How much mahar does a groom pay to his bride? This is based on custom, what's expected in a certain time and place. What are the appropriate duties and responsibilities that husbands have and wives have? So, in the United States, especially certain social classes, husbands are expected to do a portion of the housework. Husbands are supposed to do expected to do a portion of childcare. And if, let's say, I don't do that, my wife can say, you're being a bad husband. And if there was a Sharia court, she could go to the judge and say, this guy's not pulling his weight. And she would have every right to do that because the expectations of husbands and wives in relationship are based on custom, and that changes according to time and space. So how do we know whether a ruling, let's say from the Quran, or something stated in one of the hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, how do we know when one of them is one of the thawabits or one of the mutaghayirat? There's a couple of ways. One is the base, how strong is the nas, how strong is the text from the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet. For example, if you have a very clear ruling in the Quran, for example, about lahm khinzir, pork, that's very good evidence that something is not supposed to change. If you have the Prophet giving a very clear condemnation of something, then you can be pretty confident that this is also going to be prohibited, maybe in every time and space. Sometimes, a good example, liwat. Liwat is, I don't have to translate it hopefully. Liwat is sodomy. So this is prohibited in all times and places because of the strength of the Quranic story of the people of Lot, and the condemnation that the Quran gives of their behavior, and also because of hadiths on the issue, but also because of the consistent consensus of Muslim scholars generation after generation that this is prohibited. Another thing, a good example is the prohibition on silk for men, that men cannot wear silk. This comes not from the Quran, this comes from a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. But not only the hadith, but also the consistent consensus of Muslim scholars over the generations makes it clear this is something that doesn't change regardless of time or space. Of course, there's rukhsa, or a license, given by the Prophet ﷺ to Zubair ibn al-Awwam, when he had a skin condition, that he was able to wear silk there because it didn't itch, it didn't scratch his arm. So this is an example of the Prophet giving a specific license to somebody, and we can then take that license as an example that we can follow later on for, let's say, someone being allowed to wear silk for a medical reason. Okay. Now, another theoretical division when you're thinking of the rulings of Islamic law is between what's called Taurifi and mu'allal. Tawqifi and mu'allal. Tawqifi means something that is a ruling that comes from God. There's no reason for it, or at least there's no reason we understand. So, for example, there are 5 prayers. Why not 6 prayers? Why not 4 prayers? Because this is what God said and the Prophet taught us. These are the rulings from God and the Prophet, and there is no reason why, at least none that we can understand. Why is pork prohibited? You can sit around, people sometimes say, oh, pork's really unhealthy, it makes you sick. But you know what? Prior to the invention of refrigeration, pretty much everything makes you sick. So, pork would make you sick in the Arabian Peninsula, so would beef if it had been out too long. So there's no reason behind this. This is something that God gives us as a rule, and we follow it based on our faith and devotion to God. That's Taurifi. The second type is, I said, mu'allal. This means there's some reason, or illah, there's some reason for these rulings. Sometimes those reasons are explained in the Quran. Sometimes they're explained in the Sunnah of the Prophet. Sometimes they're fairly clear just from context and from the nature of the ruling. A good example of this is, a prohibition on drinking wine. People are prohibited from drinking wine because wine and other alcohol, other intoxicants make you lose your inhibitions and make you behave badly and make you irresponsible and cause you to lose your judgment and lose your senses and control of yourself. Okay. Now, of these two, of the mu'allal rulings, so first Taurifi, then mu'allal, then underneath mu'allal you have 2 types. One are a type where the cause is permanent, the reason is permanent, it's always present. Alcohol is a good example. Alcohol is going to be prohibited in every society for Muslims. So it doesn't matter if you're living in Saudi Arabia where no one's drinking, at least no one's drinking openly, or whether you're going to Georgetown University where I teach, where there's a healthy party culture, and you can say, hey, everyone around me's drinking, why, maybe I should drink. No, it doesn't matter. That cause is always present. Alcohol will always make you irresponsible, irrational, and lose control of yourself. Therefore, this is prohibited. That cause doesn't change. There are other types of mu'allal rulings where the cause can disappear. Cause can disappear and reappear. So, for example, these are actually fairly hard to find in the Quran or the Sunnah of the Prophet directly, but the idea of in zakat, that one of the groups that can get zakat is al-mu'allafa qulubuhum. This is from the Quranic discussion of zakat. So one of the groups one of the 8 types of people who can get zakat are the people whose hearts you're trying to reconcile for Islam. And that in the immediate context of the Quran's revelation, these were the elite of the Quraysh and of Thaqif tribe from Ta'if, who were given a portion of zakat and actually given back a lot of their property that had been taken when they were defeated in order to kind of reconcile their hearts to Islam and make them committed Muslims. So in the Hanafi school of law, they see that this ruling doesn't apply after that. So this group doesn't exist after the time of the Prophet. There's no more mu'allafa qulubuhum. Whereas in the other schools of law, this group is always potentially there. So, for example, in Malaysia, one of the states in Malaysia, like the United States, Malaysia is made up of different states, right? One of the states has a way of dealing with people who want to leave Islam, that the government will actually see if they need help in their business or if they need help in their personal life, if they're like suffering financially, and give them some of the zakat money, and in order to kind of endear them to the Muslim community further. But so that's a good example of the Hanafi school of law says, no, this ruling only existed at a certain time, and then the reason for it disappeared. And other schools of law say, no, the reason is always there. Okay. What's maybe the big challenge when we talk about Islamic law in the modern period is that the huge amounts of social, political, economic change that occurred with modernity, right? So, London in 1600 had more in common with Istanbul in 1600 than London in 1600 has with London today. So between roughly the early 1700s and the mid 1800s, placed first Great Britain, then Germany, then the United States, then Western Europe, goes through this immense change called modernity, which involves a complete revolution in the way human society is organized. Technology, economics, politics, the way we think about science, the way we think about religion. And then this basically gradually spreads across the globe. And so we're living in a time of that's not just a result of tremendous change in every sphere of our lives, but it's also continuously changing. So, you can imagine what it's like, let's say my great aunt, who's now 103, God preserve her life. So she was born before air travel, before, cars were widespread, before TVs, before all this stuff. And now she's living a time when there's, everybody's walking around with a superpower computer in their hand. They can look up any piece of information in the world or take pictures and all this stuff. So, just imagine how much the world has changed. So what this tremendous change means is that there's a lot of issues where we have to ask ourselves, was this ruling in Islamic law, was the cause something that was the reason for it? Was this permanent? Was this always going to be around, like the case of alcohol? Or is this something where if the cause disappears, then the ruling is going to change? And a good example of this in the pre-modern period, kind of to show that Muslims in the past also faced this kind of question, is the issue of Jummah prayer. So until the late 700s, the early 800s of the Common Era, each city had one mosque for Jummah. There was just one Jummah. Literally, there's one Jummah prayer in Kufa, in Basra, even in Baghdad originally. Everybody went to Jummah prayer. But then, a place like Baghdad, there's too many people. So they have to start building different mosques. And they actually had to sit around and ask themselves, are we allowed to build more than one mosque for Jummah? And the answer was yes, because they realized the reason for which the Muslim community had been praying in one time, one place, was actually susceptible to change as conditions changed. And then when Muslims, let's say, went to North America and Europe, and Friday is not a holiday, people have to go to work, then we have multiple Jummahs per day. And this was also very controversial when it started in Europe and in the US in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Eventually, this also became accepted because this was seen as not compromising an unchanging rule, and that the cause for this custom of having one Jummah, even in Jummah all take place at one time in a city, was something that could change based on context. A good example of modern debates, and I'm not trying to, I don't think this is a valid reason, but I'm just giving you an example, is the debate over inheritance. So some, like for example, Islamic modernists like Fazlur Rahman, professor at University of Chicago, died in 1988. He argued that the Quranic verses on inheritance were not meant to be permanent, right? They were meant to, give women access to property, to make sure that both women and men inherited, but that once you had a situation in which men and women were, let's say, financially equal or both working and both seen as having the same responsibilities in society, that idea that the man is going to inherit more than the woman and therefore is going to, because he's supposed to take care of and spend on his female relatives, that reason no longer exists, therefore the ruling of the verses no longer exists, and you should have equal inheritance. So that was people like Fazlur Rahman's argument. Now, the reason that's very controversial is because no Muslim scholar ever said that, right? So no Muslim scholar in history that I know of up until the 20th century ever had this idea. But the question is, did they not have this idea because this idea is wrong and they knew it was wrong? Or did they not have this idea because society really hadn't changed that much? So society really hadn't changed that much from the time of the Prophet. And it didn't change very much until the 19th and 20th centuries with the advent of modernity. The other really big question that comes along with this is, are these rulings supposed to respond to social change, or are they supposed to guide us in times of social change? So let's take that example of inheritance. So are we supposed to change this law, this Quranic law, right? This comes in the Quran, one of the longest verses in the Quran talking about the different shares of inheritance that people receive in a family. Are we supposed to see this as guidance for society? So what that would mean is, it would mean even if you're in a time when, my sisters have jobs just like I have a job, maybe they make more money than me, maybe my mother had a job, my father had a job. But even in a time like this, I as a son should still inherit more than my sisters because I'm supposed to have responsibility for them and for my wife, for example. Is this sort of telling us that even if society changes, there still should be kind of there's still a responsibility on men to care for their female relatives? Or is this law supposed to change based on changing society? So this issue didn't come up on inheritance because human society didn't change very much from the time of the Prophet until the modern period. Now we're actually confronted with the kind of change where men and women are both working in the same jobs. This was not something you found in human history until essentially the 20th century, really until after World War I. Okay. The second issue I want to talk about is what's called takhayyur. Sometimes people use the word talfiq, but really the correct word is takhayyur. Takhayyur means choosing between the rulings within a madhab, within a school of law, or between schools of law. So, most of you probably know that on any legal question, there's usually in any school of law more than one opinion. For example, in the Shafi'i law school, you have the old opinion, the new opinion of Imam Shafi'i, or in the Hanafi school, you have the opinion of Abu Hanifa, Imam Abu Hanifa, and then the opinions of Muhammad Hassan Shaybani and Abu Yusuf and Zufar and other people like that. So oftentimes, even within a madhab, you'll have more than one opinion. And then, of course, taken together between the madhabs, you also have more than one, kind of a menu option of opinions. So what takhayyur is picking based on need, based on situation. The general rule that Muslims have is that you should follow your school of law. And then Muslim scholars disagree about how easy it should be for you to pick within your school of law or to pick between school of law, or in the case of a scholar, how reticent or how easy it should be for a scholar to, let's say, give a fatwa based on another school of law instead of his or her own school of law. But what they all agree on is that in a situation of necessity or really pressing need, usually the words used are durura and haja, that you can choose between different schools of law in order to meet kind of social needs. So, of course, this is risky because you can get what I call the, Franken fatwa, like Frankenstein's monster, Franken fatwa. Fatwa that's just made up, a dog came and licked my pants. Oh, I'm going to take the Maliki school fatwa, dogs are not najas. Okay, then I go and I've been doing wudu, but my hair looks really good, so I don't want to mess my hair up. So I take the Shafi ruling where I just have to wipe part of my head. And then I'm praying, but I don't want to move my arms too much because I don't want to wrinkle my jacket. So I take the Hanafi ruling and I don't raise my hands in prayer when I go. Now I have a prayer that's not accepted in any of those schools of law. That's a Franken fatwa. And you do what's called fatwa shopping, where you're always looking for the easiest way in any situation. So that's a risk. But really for an individual, that's up to the person, because no one's here watching you and supervising you, except maybe your parents. But really, if you want to take a certain ruling to make your life easier or harder, only God can judge you. So you have to go by your own intentions. But then, as a community or as religious scholars, we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions, which is, what's socially at stake? What's socially at stake when we think about choosing between schools of law? For example, the issue of shaking hands between men and women. Now, in the United States and in a lot of societies, if you don't shake hands with someone, this is really offensive to them. And this really makes interaction very difficult. And you're not even going to have time to explain to them why you're not shaking their hand, right? This is going to be something that is very offensive and cause a lot of social disruption. On the other hand, wearing hijab, this should not cause social disruption. This isn't interfering with your work. This isn't interfering with your duties as a citizen or your responsibility. If people have a problem with hijab, then they're just being bigoted. This isn't getting in the way of basic social interactions. So maybe on the handshaking issue, people like the European Council on Fatwa and Research and a lot of other Muslim scholars have taken rulings in the Hanbali school that you're allowed to, if you're a female merchant in the market, you're allowed to shake hands with men. Well, we're all like merchants in the market today in our world, so that men and women are allowed to shake hands. On the other hand, you have to think about what are the potential costs of engaging in takhayyur and taking a ruling that's easy. One of the costs might be that you we break down the things that make Muslims stand out. And if a community starts stripping away all its identifying markers, everything that makes it different, well, eventually the community stops being different and actually ceases to exist, especially a community that is constantly being attacked, constantly being criticized by the government, by the president, by media, like the Muslim community. So when Muslims think about their dress, like hijab or beard for men, right, or whether men should wear like a hat, I think Muslim men should have to wear little hats, maybe to make them stand out so they carry part of the burden. If you say, well, life is difficult, I don't want to stand out. Yeah, it's going to be harder because you stand out and you get noticed, but also that actually propagates the Muslim identity. It protects our community. And the Prophet understood, ﷺ, that if you start dressing like other people, if you take on their symbols, and if you wipe away your symbols, you will become like them. And you will disappear. Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum, as the Prophet said, a hadith in Sunan Abu Dawood, right? Sunan Abi Dawood. So you have to think, what are the potential costs? Yes, it might be obnoxious. I don't want to stand out. I don't want people to look at me. But once you win people's respect and once you win a place in society, you will have secured your identity in the society. You wouldn't have given in on those markers that make you different from other people. And finally, the last point is, not just to think about what socially is at stake for the survival of the Muslim community, or whether or not a certain ruling is too disruptive to our interactions with other people or not disruptive, is what's really religiously and morally at stake. So when we think about, I keep using the word stake, it's a good segue, right? Think about the issue of halal meat. Now, this might be better at the ICNA MAS conference than the MAS-ICNA conference, because in my experience, Arabs tend to be not so strict on the halal meat issue, whereas Desis are, really strict. But when Muslims go to countries as a minority and they're very strict on halal meat, they start their own butcher shops and they start their own meat industry and even become major players in the meat industries in those countries. And so they're able to provide halal meat for their communities. Whereas if Muslims go to a place and they say, oh, we're just going to eat the meat of the people of the book, they don't actually create that religious infrastructure. They don't create that infrastructure of halal slaughterhouses and meat butchers and having meat sold in supermarkets. And so they end up actually not being able to find halal meat when they want it. So because they took the easier ruling on this, they ended up not pushing themselves to create infrastructure. You can think about it like working out, right? When you work out, it hurts, but you end up building your strength and your capacity. Whereas if you're always looking for an easy way out, yeah, your life is going to be easier, but you're not going to build yourself up as a person or as a community. And then the last part of that is to also look at, for Muslims to look at themselves as moral leaders in the society around them. We're not just reacting all the time to, how do I act as a Muslim in this society so that it can be easy for me, or how do I respond to this? But also thinking, what is the Muslim's role as moral leaders, as khayr ummatin ukhrijat linnas, as the best community brought out for the people to serve humanity. And so when we talk about, let's say, the issue of halal meat, we need to think about the ethical treatment of animals. We need to think about what our religion teaches us about how animals have to be cared for and can't be put in horrible factory conditions and can't suffer and can't see each other slaughtered, right? And that something being halal is a lot more than just having someone say Bismillah when they kill the animal. And so we should think about, how can Muslims contribute to stewardship of the planet by eating less meat, by having society as a whole eat less meat, because livestock take up a huge amount of land and a huge amount of resources, and they fart out massive amounts of methane and cause climate change and all these things. So Muslims, by advocating more like humane or moral treatment of animals, also are helping to promote a more moral and sustainable treatment of the planet as a whole. So Muslims shouldn't just be reacting, but we should think about these issues as questions of our moral leadership in the Muslim community. So to end on, just to review, there's two types of rulings in Islam: ones that change, one that don't change regardless of time and circumstance. And amongst those rulings that change, some change because the ruling disappears, and sometimes the ruling is always there, so they don't change. And we have to ask ourselves, when we're picking between different rulings and between the different schools of law in America, to what extent are we really responding to a pressing need that merits us taking an easier option? But what are the costs of doing that too? Are we crippling ourselves? Are we not pushing ourselves to establish ourselves more, to become more self-reliant? And to what extent are we also, by doing that, shirking a potential role as moral leaders in the society? Jazakum Allahu khair.